I'd like to bring up Paul Saffo now as our last speaker here. So Paul is certainly one of the leading futurists in the world. I think he definitely holds that title. He's been involved with the Institute for the Future for quite a while as a Roy Amara Fellow. He's now a consulting professor at Stanford University, which maybe he can say a little bit about what all he's doing at Stanford, because I'm not too sure. So take it away, Paul.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is my mic on? Yes, it is. Well, first of all, just a time check. I know we've been running late, and I learned a long time ago to never stand between engineers and the liquidity preference function. So I'm going to be brief. I'm also going to talk a little bit less about the future and a little bit more about the present and something I think that must be done. Now, some context. Quite obviously, we can hear the Doppler whistle of approaching AGI. You know, it has the smell of inevitability, but it also has a high level of uncertainty. Now, I've been a forecaster for a couple of decades, and I know there are two kinds of uncertainty that happen. One is uncertainty because of bad forecasting or forecasting error, or you just haven't seen enough information. However, there's a second kind of uncertainty, and that's intrinsic uncertainty, where things are arriving, but they are still very plastic and still very protean, and you ask yourself, are the causal, the factors that are going to cause this thing to eventually arrive, is the weight of them mostly behind us or mostly in front of us? And I think that while there is lots behind, and there's lots of history in this field, this is a moment where the uncertainty is coming because of the stuff that has yet to happen. And what's interesting about that is I think we're in a moment here of a handoff. It happens with all technology diffusion. Early on, the small band of pioneers, Neil and I have known each other for many years. Our first encounter was when I was playing a very small role in the engine room of the infant AI industry, trying to commercialize it. I think Neil is, what was the famous quote of, I think it was Don Rickles. He said he'd been in radio so long, or he'd been in TV so long, he'd been in it since it was radio. Well, this room is full of people like that who've been in this business. There's lots going on, but it ends up being a very obscure area, only professionals touch it. And then as they succeed, like the examples that you saw from both Neil and Ben, as it succeeds, it seeps into popular culture until we reach a point at which there's a handoff. And the inventors and the scientists and the innovators hand off the field to popular culture. And from that point onwards, it's an interaction between popular culture and invention that makes things happen. And we, of course, know that inventors swim in a sea of culture, no matter how reclusive they are. And in the last 100 years or so, there are plenty of examples. A wildly disproportionate number of scientists on the Manhattan Project were influenced in their youth by H.G. Wells writing about super bombs. And not just the original Mercury astronauts, but most of the scientists working on the space program were raised being steeped in space opera and Buck Rogers and the like. And then famously, the last decade was really, if you had to think of something that organized the last decade and the whole dot-com thingy, it was the publication of a book in 1984 called Neuromancer by Bill Gibson. And that's an especially important example, which I'll come back to, because, of course, the important thing about Bill is he had many, many talents, but computer scientist was not one of them. And he typed that on an old-fashioned typewriter. And he noticed, had that instinct of people of novelists and poets who swim in a space. They hear all the same things we hear, but they interpret them differently. Of Bill's many talents, his was to look at words like interface and all these computer geek terms that were either utilitarian to the professionals or obscure to outsiders. And he said, that's a really beautiful word, interface. And what does that mean? And that's how we got Neuromancer. Well, this is the point where the public is about to join in this whole discussion. And the proof of the press conference of this press coverage of this conference is proof. And you should prepare yourselves because you're going to get a lot more questions from people after you go home and you go back to work. So that's the good news. The public is joining in. The bad news is the public's joining in at a moment when pessimism is the new black. Everything, endism is in. It's the end of the world. One of the best-selling books this year is this summer, summer read on the beach is The World Without Us. It's actually a marvelous book. The SETI program that's been going on for decades, I'm part of a small group that, I'll admit, we're paranoid. We are actually saying, and it's ironic given that, the Pioneer spacecraft is where it is, saying, it might not be a really good idea to start sending radio messages out into space because maybe they're not friendly. Or as my mother would say when I was a child, there are some times when children should be very small and very quiet. Now, so what we've had so far with the discussions around singularity, and we have novels and things written, but it's mostly by computer scientists, and it tends towards the lurid or the really pessimistic. The Matrix is not a happy description of a future. I'll admit I also, in this area of AGI, have been partly responsible for spreading trouble, when I've passed around the observation that, well, when AGI finally arrives, if we're, the optimistic scenario is they'll treat us like pets, and the pessimistic scenario is they'll treat us like food. What's missing from all of this is a positive, compelling vision out of popular culture that ordinary people can buy into. And I actually went back and I looked and I tried to find one that wasn't written by a computer scientist. And I was astounded because I had to look back. Sorry, I've been neglecting my slides. I had to look back 40 years. 40 years, in fact, it'll be exactly 40 years in just a month, October 1967. And it was a little collection of poems written by a poet named Richard Brautigan, who, it was interesting. Just for a moment, put yourself into October 1967. What had just happened? The Summer of Love. It was a period, the Vietnam War was in full swing. It was also a period of pessimism. If you said computer to most people in San Francisco at the time, they would have instantly shot back with do not mutilate, do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. And I haven't even been to the liquidity preference function yet. It was a very negative view of computers. And yet Richard Brautigan wrote a very, very positive poem. One other detail before I show you the poem. He also anticipated a lot about today. If you read the permission sheet, it looks like Creative Commons to me. Permission is granted to reprint any of these poems in magazines, books, and newspapers if they're given away free. He didn't include computers or PowerPoint, but I infer that he probably included them. And what I particularly love about my copy, there are 1,500 copies of this printed and handed out for free. It was done on a mimeograph machine, and the copy that happened to end up in my possession had the quintessential 1967 inscription, "Happy birthday, Tinkerbell, Peter Pan." October 10th, 1967. Pure 1960s stuff. But I think you'll see here, I want to show you the poem, and I want to read it. Oops. I just pushed the wrong button. Let's try this one. Okay. It's a little blurry up there. I apologize for that. I'll just close your eyes and listen as I read this. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think right now, please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. By the way, he had just come off being poet in residence at Caltech, so I think he'd seen a lot of magnetic tape drives. I like to think, and it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. I think that's a wonderful sentiment. Now, it is a shame that Brodigan passed away in 1972. He, of course, he would have been 72 years old today. But I think we can take a lesson from this. On your to-do list that you're writing down during this conference, of course, talk to the engineers and the software programmers and the venture capitalists and worry about the social issues and the like. But here's what we need. We need more poets. We need more novelists to explore this field. And by novelists, I don't mean moonlighting computer scientists. I mean non-professionals, people like Bill Gibson, who are unconstrained by preoccupations about what this stuff is and can think freely about what it could be. So if you want advanced AGI and the singularity to arrive sooner and, more importantly, in the shape that you think it should be rather than the shape that you hope it will not be, my advice is when you go home, find some poets and novelists and whisper in their ears about this stuff. Thank you.